Hello, welcome everyone. We are so excited to have you joining us tonight. Um, we are excited to welcome you to the Harvard Buddhist Community 2021 Buddhism and Race Speaker Series, which is organized by the Harvard Buddhist Community, a student club at Harvard Divinity School. My name is Eva, and I am a member of the Buddhism and Race Planning Committee. Like Chantel and Kyla, my home is in Somerville, Massachusetts, home of the Massachusetts people. Today, the Massachusetts people remain in New England and in diaspora, along with their indigenous neighbors, including the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples. If you would like to know more about land acknowledgements and further actions you can take to support indigenous people in Massachusetts, you can visit the website for the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness. We also encourage you to learn more about the history, which may include genocide and colonization of the place where you live, as well as about the indigenous communities currently living near you. We are pasting links in the chat to help you get started. Since 2015, our annual Buddhism and Race Conference has brought together Sangha leaders, activists, scholars, and students from diverse backgrounds to build capacity in addressing power at the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, and class in our communities. This year, the conference has been reimagined as a speaker series with monthly virtual events from January through August. We believe strongly in supporting racial justice, not only with our words, but also with our actions. In the past, we've encouraged participants to donate to BIPOC-led organizations. This month, in honor of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and in the spirit of Chenxing Han's work, and if it's COVID safe to do so, of course, we encourage you to visit a local Buddhist temple that supports Asian Americans in your community and make a donation there. If you're signed into our webinar, closed captioning is available. We are recording the event tonight and will make it publicly available on our YouTube page. Tonight's event features Chenxing Han, author of Be the Refuge, and co-organizer of May We Gather, a Buddhist memorial for Asian American ancestors. In one moment, we will launch a poll for our webinar participants. This is a new thing we're trying this month. We're going to see how it goes. And it will ask if you've read Chenxing Han's book and if you attended or watched the May We Gather memorial. Chenxing will be addressing both of these in her dialogue with Dr. Nalika Gajaweera tonight. So we will launch this poll and pause for about 30 seconds or so to allow participants to answer it.
Great, thank you all for that. And so my name is Chantel Sanchez, and I'm also part of the Buddhism and Race Planning Committee. Our series hopes to both respond to the virtual environment we find ourselves in, as well as this particular socio-political moment in US history. The events of the past year have demonstrated how structural racism has engendered systemic suffering that literally kills Black and Brown people and destroys communities of color. With these racial violences in sight, it is clearer than ever that racism is the issue of our time. The Sangha is not immune or separate from these issues. In fact, an apolitical version of the Dharma is a direct product of white supremacy, which further codifies oppressions and reproduces anti-Blackness, as well as other forms of racism in and around our communities. We need to bring the tradition forward to unwaveringly meet the issues of race and racism.
Thanks, Eva and Chantel. My name is Kyla Franks, and I'm also a member of the Buddhism and Race Planning Committee. We are so excited to welcome everyone here to the 5th monthly event in the 2021 Buddhism and Race Speaker Series. The title of this series is Radical Reorientation, and our goals for the series are twofold. First, we are focusing on building a shared understanding of Buddhist approaches to racial justice with a critical examination of racism and white supremacy in Buddhist communities and scholarship. Second, we are focusing on the collective work of addressing internalized oppression, which obstructs both individuals and communities from living into their full potential. We seek to move beyond an abstract, apolitical, and individualistic engagement with the Dharma. Instead, we seek to cultivate spiritual practices that can tend to the myriad forms of embodied and socially imposed sufferings created by what Bell Hooks refers to as the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. In short, we are called toward a radical reorientation of the Dharma, to move beyond racial integration toward decolonized, indigenized, and anti-racist practices and communities.
Before I introduce our speakers today, I am excited to see that we've got about 150 people already signed on between here and YouTube, with more people joining every second. We are so glad to have you here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So tonight, Chenxing and Nalika will have a 50-minute dialogue, followed by about 25 minutes for question and answer. We will keep the chat open throughout this presentation. If you want your message to go to everyone, make sure that you're sending your chat message to all panelists and attendees. Please know that any hateful or violent speech in the chat won't be tolerated, and we may choose to remove participants from the event. Also, if engaging in the chat conversation doesn't feel supportive to you tonight, please know that links to any important resources in the chat will also be sent in the follow-up email. We are also posting instructions on how to disable the chat feature in the chat. So without further ado, it is truly my honor to introduce the fifth speaker in the Harvard Divinity School Buddhism and Race Speaker Series, Chenxing Han. Chenxing Han is a Bay Area-based writer whose publications have appeared in Buddha Dharma, Journal of Global Buddhism, Lion's Roar, Pacific World, Tricycle, and elsewhere. She holds a BA from Stanford University and an MA in Buddhist Studies from the Graduate Theological Union. After studying chaplaincy at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California, she worked in spiritual care at a nearby community hospital in Oakland. Her first book, Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists, was published by North American Books in January 2021. Welcome, Chenxing. We are also very excited that tonight's event features Chenxing Han in conversation with anthropologist Dr. Nalika Gajaweera, and it's my honor to introduce Nalika as well. Nalika is a research anthropologist at the Center for Religion and Civic Culture at the University of Southern California. Her specializations are in the anthropology of religion, with a specific interest in the intersections of Buddhism, race, ethno-nationalism, and gender. She has studied these issues most in depth in the context of Sri Lanka and the United States. Welcome, 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 Chenxing and Nalika. We are so honored to have you both with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introductions for both of us. I'll give a short introduction, and I just really wanted to send my appreciation and thanks to all the organizers putting this together, this series. I've learned so much already from the past few months of discussions and presentations you've had. And I'm just very excited to be in discussion with Chenxing today. I'm a Sri Lankan American Buddhist myself, and as an anthropologist, also interested in issues of race and ethnicity in Sri Lanka and the States. I'm thrilled to share this platform with Chenxing, and honored to talk about and nerd out really about the betwixt and betweenness of being an Asian American Buddhist today. So.
Thanks, Nalika. I want to thank also the Radical Reorientation team. It's been such a joy to work with such a friendly and engaged group of people. Liam, I'm sorry you can't be here, but you designed the most amazing flyers, so thank you for that. Thank you, Eva, Chantel, Kyla, and big thanks also to Xavier for your tech genius of helping this all run smoothly. Nalika, it's such a delight to be in conversation with you. I remember first learning about you actually through your Tricycle article on yoga and mindfulness several years back. talk. And I'm really grateful you attended the October, sort of my first unofficial book event last October with Reverend Zenju Earthlyn Manuel. And you asked this really thoughtful question about how Asian American Buddhists can kind of critically engage with the tradition. So I've just so appreciated our conversation since then, and especially your perspective as someone who was born in the States, but then grew up in Sri Lanka, but then have also lived much of your adult life here in the US. And of course, also as an anthropologist, which I think I secretly want to be an anthropologist. So there's a sort of anthropological ethnographic spirit in my book as well. And yeah, I'm really excited to do this nerding out with you. And also thank you so much for everyone in the audience today. I'm sorry we can't see each other in this format, but it's so wonderful to hear from you in the chat. I'm really grateful, things are opening up more. So I'm grateful for you for taking this time to be with us online. Hopefully some of you are, online and outdoors at the same time. That's especially lovely. It's really nice to see both familiar names and to get to meet new folks this way. And I don't know if we'll get to see the poll results, Xavier, but I am curious to know how many people have attended May We Gather. Oh, here they are. We get to enjoy them. Wow, I'm so touched. Actually, almost half of you have been able to watch the May We Gather, were able to attend or watch. And a good proportion of you, maybe about 30%, have also read some or all of my books. So thank you so much. That's really helpful for giving us a sense of where people are coming from, and we'll offer some context on both the book and May We Gather for those who aren't as familiar with them. So yeah, today's I guess event is a bit more dialogical than our previous speakers have been. So I hope you'll all in the audience just get cozy, maybe grab a cup of tea and just join us for this conversation. And I also, on this topic of previous speakers, just want to thank our previous speakers. Larry, back in, I think it was January 28th. I remember the day because it was the day I had my book launch at the Institute of Buddhist Studies. Larry's beautiful PowerPoint of the increasing diversity of insight communities in the US. And then in February, we had Rhonda McGee, who so skillfully guided us in learning how to embody mindfulness in our efforts of addressing racial injustice. And then in March, Duncan Williams, one of my co-organizers for the May We Gather event, illuminating the history of Japanese American Buddhists and really weaving that together with our present anti-Asian violence that we're facing, and also the fight for reparations more broadly. And then, of course, last month we had Anne Glagg, and just really appreciated her wealth of resources. I know, Nalika, that you work with Anne as well, and she's such an inspiration. So such a wealth of resources for helping us think through whiteness and white supremacy in American Buddhism. So here we are in May, this Heritage Month that celebrates Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians and Desis. And honestly, we're a group that is so complex, it's kind of hard to find an acronym that really we can all fit under. But what has united many of us, unfortunately, over, let's see, I'm having some questions about, is it hard to hear? Speak a little louder. Okay, let me move my microphone here. Is that any better for people? Great, sorry about that. So as I was saying, that what has united many of us during this Heritage Month is, unfortunately, this feeling of kind of a relentless anti-Asian violence, and of course also this global pandemic. And I just wanted to invite us all, kind of in the midst of all of that, if you're comfortable, just to take a breath together as we collectively hold this suffering together and also collectively wish for peace and for well-being. Thank you. So before I dive into my conversation with Nalika, I wanted to read a section from my book that I actually haven't read this section in its entirety. And as I was thinking about what to read today to kind of bring us all onto the same page, as it were, this section from the final chapter of my book, which is titled Solidarity, really stuck out as something that just felt fitting for our time together today. And I'd say this chapter really epitomizes the kind of hybrid and kaleidoscopic approach that I took in writing this book. So some people have described this book as a symphony that melts together different voices. And some people have called it a kind of mosaic that's bringing together different pieces, or also like a woven tapestry that's threading together all of these different strands. And I especially like this metaphor of weaving, because it recalls the word sutra in Buddhism or our Buddhist scriptures. So sutra having this root meaning of thread. So I'm going to read, and I thought to accompany my reading, I'll just share a few images, and just give me a moment as I share my screen. And for those who want to follow along, this is on page 209. And I just started with this image briefly because this was the event I mentioned in October with the wonderful Reverend Senju Manuel. And she recently published this book, The Deepest Peace. A note of caution from Chimamanda Adichie. The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. What is your name, and what does your name mean? My name is Tao, and it means filial piety, a virtue of respect for one's parents and ancestors. What would your ideal Buddhist community look like? The following passage is my favorite quote regarding an ideal Buddhist community and spiritual friendships. Ananda, the Buddha's cousin and later disciple, approaches the Buddha, intent on sharing a thought, something, perhaps the cumulative effect of day-to-day association with the Buddha, has suddenly made him realize that such lovely companionship is far more crucial to spiritual progress than he had imagined. He enthusiastically declares, Lord, this spiritual friendship, spiritual companionship, and spiritual intimacy is no less than half of the spiritual life. Say not so, Ananda, the Buddha replies. It is the whole, not the half of the spiritual life. Many of those Buddhists who are familiar with this concept of spiritual friendship or kalyana mitrata think of it in terms of a teacher-disciple relationship or vertical friendship. As a result, they pay little attention to a vital dimension of spiritual friendship that could be called horizontal friendship, that is, friendship with one's peers. And this is Tao again speaking. My ideal Buddhist community would consist of friendships described in the above passage, a community where we are able to learn from each other in horizontal friendship. We can relate based on sharing similar Buddhist values and principles. We are able to support each other through the good and bad times. We can bond over good conversation or shared interests. American Buddhism, Peter Gregory argues, is a phenomenon far too large for any one person to grasp in its totality. Gregory likens our attempts to categorize and describe the complicated phenomenon of American Buddhism to the parable of the elephant and the blind men, each convinced their part, trunk, ear, torso, leg, tusk, tail, is the whole. I used to believe that American Buddhism is an elephant divided, the white side on prominent display, the Asian side consigned to the shadows. And then I started to listen to people like George and Tao. And what I heard were stories of interconnection, overcoming conflict, solidarity, healing division. What I heard were stories of spiritual friendship. Friendship that traverses boundaries of race and ethnicity, age and generation, sect and tradition, gender and sexuality, class and ability, language, and nationality. These stories give me hope that American Buddhism is far more dynamic and diverse than any one of us can fully imagine. In 2008, a group of friends banded together to start the blog Dharma Folk. They signed their blog posts Arundhati, John, Kudos, and Oz. The University Buddhist Association, UBA, had united them despite their different cultural backgrounds, though I wouldn't learn this until many years later. That year, for the first time in his life, Aaron felt disconnected from the Buddhist community. Having graduated, he was no longer reaching out to different sanghas to bring speakers to campus, no longer arranging for his fellow students, Asian American and otherwise, to visit their local Sri Lankan, Chinese, Thai, and other temples. Aaron started browsing the Buddhist blogosphere, and that's when he noticed the lack of Asian Americans, a glaring contrast to his UBA experiences. We weren't there. There was this absence. Aaron wanted to do something about that absence, and he didn't want to do it alone. He thought about his friend John. He's white, but he's very deeply involved in the Buddhist community, so I felt John understood the world I grew up in. Aaron ran an idea by John. Hey, why don't we start a blog? We can just talk about the world that we're in, and we'd be adding something else to the discussion that no one else is adding. With the help of Eric and Oz, that's exactly what they did. It's funny, Aaron muses, because the angry Asian part really spun out of that. Discrimination as a racial and religious minority, confusion and anger at the appropriation of Buddhism, conviction that her Buddhist faith and her belief in social justice are inseparable. Tasja writes about these topics and more in a June 2011 post on her blog, Womanist Musings. I have plenty to be angry about in this world, and my anger at injustice does not make me a lesser Buddhist, she insists. Of course, there was backlash from white readers, but there was also a response from another young adult Asian American woman. Liriel is neither Sinhalese nor a Sri Lankan Buddhist, yet she finds many points of commonality with Tasja. Thank you so much for writing this. I am constantly frustrated by the invalidation of my Buddhist experience by the mainstream American Buddhist powers as so much cultural baggage that modern, rational Buddhism needs to be cleansed of. But every time I dip my toes into the waters of the US mainstream to try to put forth another perspective, I am inundated with comments like, the West has a lot to offer to the stagnant, codified Asian practices. And we in the West offer hope of rejuvenation. And perhaps my all-time favorite by a well-respected white American convert Buddhist about feminism in Buddhism. If we had not spoken up, the Buddhist women's movement, which started less than 20 years ago, would not even exist. Things might not have changed for another 2,500 years. And reading things like that, I don't know how I should open myself up to more abuse and silencing. I am hurt, and more than that, I am angry. But even more than that, I am tired. Oh, Jesus. Nothing I say as a woman of color ever seems to be of any consequence to the all-knowing white Buddhist establishment who remain determined as ever to tell me how I'm doing Buddhism wrong. So I wanted to let you know that your words here were of consequence to this Buddhist woman of color, that your words spoke to a beaten down, fatigued part of me and inspired me. Your words make me want to write my own Buddhism out of solidarity rather than out of anger, because you have reminded me that as white as Buddhism sometimes feels, my Buddhism is not monochromatic and I am not alone. Tasja's reply is equally heartfelt. Lirio, I can't begin to tell you how much your words mean to me. I too often feel like I don't know enough about the texts and history of Buddhism when faced with the white Buddhist establishment. I'm so sorry you have had to endure the silencing and racism you described. I have not interacted extensively with the white Buddhist community, and so I've been spared some of the painful realities of that in some ways. I used to think that I didn't know as much as they do about Buddhism, and then I realized the history and context of Buddhism is written on my body, it's molded on my skin, it flows in my blood, it filled the air I breathed when I was born in Sri Lanka. We have everything we need right here. I hope you keep writing about your Buddhist experience as well. I would love for us to continue being in conversation. Witnessing the exchange between Tasja and Lirio, the angry Asian Buddhist finds reason for optimism. Sometimes it feels as though I'm the only Asian American Buddhist blogger out there, but it's times like these that remind me I'm not alone. There are hundreds of thousands of Asian American Buddhists in this country, and we are ready to speak out and stand up for our inclusion, dignity, and respect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chenxing, for sharing those pages and those words from your interlocutors. Can you hear me? Can you hear me speak? I can't.
Yes, I can hear you speak.
Excellent. Okay, great. Thank you so much. I was just saying that it was wonderful to hear you read directly from your book. And I'm excited to kind of jump back into it as well in some parts of our conversation. I thought that a place that we could jump off our conversation today is by framing your book in terms of situating it in the particular social and political climate we as Asian Buddhists find ourselves today. You were, as we were talking early in the day in the event, involved in the planning and programming of the May We Gather event that took place on May 4th, which was a National Buddhist Memorial for Asian American ancestors that in particular was commemorating the 49th day after the horrific murder of 8 individuals in Atlanta, Georgia, 6 of whom were Asian American women, including the 63-year-old Buddhist Young A.U. It has been 3 weeks since this event, which has been historic in many ways. So, and I was wondering if, given this amount of time since the event has passed, if you could share a little bit about how the event has impacted you and some reflections on its impact on the communities you speak to.
Yeah, I think I've heard from a lot of people that the event felt healing and also very much historic. And I still feel very much the impact of the event reverberating with me even now. And I'd say something else that's really struck me is several people have commented that in attending that event or viewing the video afterwards, and the video is available for anyone who wants to watch it at the website www.maywegather.org. So in watching that video, some people have really felt this is American Buddhism, this kind of coming together, this diversity of traditions, of languages, of different lineages, right? Seeing all of these different chants and rituals all together in one place. And it was incredibly moving to know that more than 1,700 people joined us for the live stream, and I think the video has been watched more than 8,000 times. So it's just such a powerful statement of our care for each other, of our interconnectedness with each other. And I know several, about half of the people here or so haven't been able to attend the event. And I just wanted to share some of the images from the event for those who weren't able to. And for those who were able to, hopefully it's a reminder of that as well. So let me just share my screen once more. Give me one moment. Can I have a thumbs up if we're seeing the May We?
Just do the presenter view.
Are we in presenter view or are we in the poster view?
Presenter view, not the poster. Yeah, sorry.
So is this good?
Yes.
Thanks. It's always a little confusing with 2 monitors. So here's a poster of the event from May 4th. the graphic was designed by Rob Sato, and our web designer, Brian Ong, helped design this poster. And what I really love about this image, first of all, is just how colorful it is. It reminds me of being in Laos a few years ago, up in Luang Prabang for the New Year there in April. And people were wearing these really colorful, their finest clothing at the Buddhist temples in celebration. And so we see here these images of people in different colored outfits, robes, monastics and lay people holding these pink lotuses beneath this larger pink lotus. And the lotus is a symbol, of course, of awakening, enlightenment in Buddhist traditions. And it's also this flower that blossoms from muddy waters. In fact, as Duncan had told us back in March, it doesn't grow in just pure, clean water. And that's a really powerful metaphor of where enlightenment comes from this very places of suffering and difficulty, from this, samsaric world in which we live. And then out of this pink lotus also arises this moon, which is also a powerful symbol in a lot of Buddhist traditions, and this moon that has these golden cracks in it. And here's an image of Duncan speaking at the event, one of my co-organizers, along with Funi Su and myself. And we held the event at Higashi Honganji Temple in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. That was very much intentional because this very temple was vandalized just earlier this year. The two beautiful lanterns that stand at the entrance of the temple were knocked down. The stands were set on fire. A window was broken. And it was thanks to this groundswell of community support that the temple was restored, in time for us to hold the temple there. This graphic too is also by Rob Sato. And as Nalika mentioned, one of the major impetuses for this event was the rising anti-Asian violence that we've been facing, and particularly the Atlanta area shootings. So this is an image of Young-ae Yu, who's a Korean American Buddhist, and she raised two sons whose father is Black. And we showed a video as part of our ceremony, a video clip of these two sons. This is her son, Robert, recalling the moment when he found out it was his mother who had been one of the people who had been killed in the shootings. And for us, this was a way to remind ourselves that this kind of violence is not abstract, that it has just deep repercussions for individuals, for their families. And in order to honor Young-ae Yu and other Asian American Buddhists of our times, but also historically who've been killed due to violence, central to this ceremony were these memorial tablets that were created. You see on the very left, Sia Banning, who was killed among several dozens of other miners in Wyoming back in 1885. And then we have Kanesaburo Oshima, who was killed in a Japanese American, who was one of several Japanese Americans who died in the internment camps. And Kanesaburo Oshima in particular was killed by guards. So this was in 1942. Then we have Tien Minh Lee, who was killed in 1996 by white supremacists, Vietnamese American Buddhists. I'll skip over the middle for a second here. And then Tommy Lay, who in 2017, he's a Vietnamese American who was killed by police, and he was just holding a pen, knocking on a door with it. And then we have Wichao Ratanapakdi, who was assaulted in January and died of his injuries, a Thai American Buddhist living in San Francisco, and finally Young-ae Yu, whom we mentioned. And we also felt it was important to have this central tablet for all beings, of any racial ethnic background who have lost their lives through racial and religious animus, because our lives are very much intertwined. As Buddhist teachings teach us, the systems that produce this kind of violence are all connected. And also central to our ceremony was a ritual around this lotus. So if you look closely, there are cracks in this lotus. And this lotus was handmade by James Okumura and very lovingly and carefully flown from Northern California to Southern California, where our ceremony was held. And throughout the ceremony, the Buddhist leaders were able to carefully paint the cracks in the lotus with gold in something called the art of kintsugi, this Japanese art that Duncan also described for us back in March, whereby if we have, let's say, a broken ceramic, instead of throwing it away, we carefully piece it back together. And then instead of pretending that there aren't these fractures, we actually highlight the fractures with gold. And I think this gold also recalls the ways in many, for example, Southeast Asian Buddhist countries, we gild Buddhist statues one at a time by applying that gold leaf. And you end up with something of great beauty, something that gleams. And we do this, of course, collectively. And then during our ceremony, we also had 6 Dharma messages on the 6 paramitas, which are the perfected qualities of enlightened beings. So this is actually a Chinese newspaper reporting on the event that created this image. And we have Bishop Noriaki Ito, who is the bishop of our host temple, and he spoke on Prajna Paramita, or wisdom. And then Sister Ginyam, who's part of Deer Park Monastery, she spoke on Shila, or ethics, ethical conduct. And then Bhante Sanata Vihari, who gave his Dharma message in Spanish, which I just found to be so moving and beautiful. He spoke on kshanti, or patience, how to have patience in times when it is actually quite difficult. And Bhante Sanata Vihari serves at the Sarat Chandra Buddhist Temple, which is a predominantly Sri Lankan Buddhist temple, though it also serves Thai Americans. And then Bishop Myoke Kane Barrett gave a beautiful talk on dhyana meditation. She's in Texas with the Nichiren Buddhist temple there. Reverend Christina Moon gave an extremely moving talk on virya, or spiritual energy, vigor. And she actually flew all the way from Hawaii, from Chozenji Temple, to be with us. And then I'm sure many people on the call know of Dr. Larry Ward of the Lotus Institute, who came up from San Diego to join us. And he spoke, just gave a very rousing speech on dana, or generosity, which is so foundational to the Buddhist path. And, we talked about this event being historic and healing. And I think part of that was actually the media coverage in the LA Times and also in the New York Times, to be recognized on this national scale when so many have felt isolated, erased, invisibilized. To be seen and heard in this way was also very powerful. And a lot of people commented on the masks as well that the leaders were wearing. So I just wanted to show an image of Reverend Shumio Kojima, who led the procession into the temple as our Buddhist leaders filed in one by one. He handmade each and every one of these masks. And he's also a very gifted calligrapher. So he did the calligraphy for our memorial tablets and also for these masks. They say Namu Sanbo, which means homage to the triple gem, to the 3 jewels of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And then another really important piece of the ceremony, how we decided to close it, was around thread, actually. And this image is from one of my favorite temples in Bangkok, where I lived from 2018 to 2020, from Wat Sutat in the old city of Bangkok. And you can't see it in this picture, but these white threads are connected to the Buddha statue in the hall. These, if you ever get a chance to go, this temple is extraordinary. There's these 3-story tall murals, and they are absolutely just stunning. So in a similar vein, there in Los Angeles, as part of our closing procession, we had the Buddhist leaders process out in pairs, holding these white threads, these parita, parit threads. So these are protective threads that connect us all the way to the Buddha. And literally these 2 threads are actually connected to the Buddha on the altar. And as they processed out, the threads took them all the way out to the lanterns that had been broken. So let me stop my share there. And just wanted to say, I was in conversation with you, Nalika, a few weeks before May 4th, and I noticed that you had a thread on your wrist. So we were talking about that, the ways that it symbolizes protection. Like if we'd had time during the May 4th, we would have tied white threads around everyone, around thousands of people around their wrists. And perhaps we'd all still be wearing these threads, even if they might be a little frayed from taking
I have
showers.
Mine from like a member last year that I received and never take those off.
Exactly. Yeah. So I guess just in response to the question, I feel for me, it was the beauty of the ceremony that really is still like resonating with me and thinking about how that beauty was quite literally crafted by so many people in community, and also how that beauty is indebted to this deep history of Asian and Asian American ancestors who essentially we've inherited this kind of beauty from.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all those reflections and the pictures for those of us who were not there. I mean, I was there, but for those in the audience who may not be there, definitely go check it out on the YouTube. So let's jump into your book. I was feeling that for me, reading the book, one of the key arguments, I'm an anthropologist, so I was like also reading it, you don't write it as a scholarly book, and you're writing it for the public, for your interlocutors as well. But there is this subtle and creative argument that you're making, and you weave throughout the book, which is that you challenge in many ways this idea that often prevails in popular and scholarly conversations about Buddhism in the West, that there's this typology of two Buddhisms in the West, that of the ethnic Asian and then the white convert Buddhist. And in some ways, the way that typology is used is to bring into light the place of the heritage Buddhist in the US. But my take reading a book, particularly in your approach to sharing the complexity of the experience of Asian American Buddhists, your interlocutors, is that this kind of dualism still problematically relies on a contrast that centers and privileges white convert Buddhist as the norm. So the self and other, if you will, the self as white and the other, all ethnic Asians, others. Can you share a little bit about how the complexities of the stories you share of the young adults in this book turns this dualism on its head?
Yeah, I'm just really glad you bring up this kind of dualism, because I think that's really at the heart of it, that the people I interviewed just didn't fit neatly into these dualities of white convert, immigrant Asian. I mean, even as myself as an Asian American convert Buddhist. And I'm thinking about, for example, just recently I was been in conversation with An Tran and Kazi Rehan. We'll be in conversation together for a panel in June. And we were discussing just the ways in which these dualities of, let's say, there's white and Asian, there's Eastern and Western, right? There's I'll try to make sure I get the binaries right. Rational and devotional, or logical and intuitive, or even how that's mapped onto masculine, feminine, meditation and chanting, right? Universal and particular, mind and body. So we were talking about how for us, the experience of being Asian American Buddhist is very much a hybrid experience. And I would say that it's just hybridizes these binaries. It just doesn't, it kind of explodes them open in a way, actually. Or another way to think about it, the ways in which we as Asian American Buddhists defy categorization, I think of us as sort of queering these binaries, to borrow a term from Shalan Hu. And so for me, I think what I was really interested in bringing forth so many different voices, weaving them together, is to show us what it might look like when we center Asian American Buddhists. I think what actually emerges is a kind of exploration and envisioning of what a more culturally engaged Buddhism, what a more intersectional form of Buddhism might look like.
It really, for me, kind of brought to light, even the concept of heritage Buddhism, that is some ways now the more woke way of talking about it. But at the same time, I think that it still kind of relies on this imaginary, not imaginary, the kind of normative, making the white Buddhist kind of the norm of it. And so I love how you kind of just put that aside and just kind of center the complexity of these voices. So I really appreciate you for doing that. So this is more, my next question is less of a question and more of a comment, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. One of the things that I found very refreshing, listening to the voices of the young adults you spoke to, was how they in many ways resist not idealizing their Buddhist tradition. So I would like to take, for example, this one of the things that one of your interlocutors, Dava, talks about, and it's on page 100 for those of you following. And Dava here says, quote, "My experience and interactions with my religion have become more complex as I've gotten older. I've seen some religious leaders for the flawed human beings that they are, and discovered that a prayer will not solve everything. but I do find it to be a comfort in some of the difficulty of transition, or in times of difficulty or transition. I'm not ashamed to say that this is when I find myself in front of the altar mumbling a few prayers I know. I really love how she's so, there's a humility in that. And later she also adds, I've also grown to see the value in having religious teachers who know me closely and respect as a result of the relationships, seeing how they interact with their followers, the way they treat those around them. I'm also not direct quoting them, so I might be missing some words. She then says, or they say, talking specifically about one of these teachers, quote, he's not an all holy, perfect being, but he's a good teacher that we will turn to help and for guidance, and who we will wholeheartedly support however we can. I quote that extensively because a couple of things come to my mind when I read it. There's both this resistance to not idealizing the tradition and how it fits into the lived reality of their own lives, and a non-idealization of their own practice, and as well as their leaders. And for me, there's that last part about wholeheartedly supporting however way we can, really talks about the emphasis on responsibility and obligation to care and foster those communities. And I found that such an important piece to surface. And if you could share a little bit about that piece.
Yeah, I just love what Dawa shared because it felt so realistic and it felt so culturally rooted, really. And I think what struck me is that she, and I think many of the second generation Buddhists in particular, whom I spoke to, had a more transnational view on Buddhism. And I think sometimes within American Buddhism, there are just certain narratives we inherit, like this two Buddhisms narrative, or certain stereotypes that it makes it easy to romanticize Buddhism. But it's harder for people, like we've talked about this before, Dejanu, for example, who grapples with what does it mean when in Sri Lanka, Buddhism and Sinhalese nationalism can be tied together. So she's not comfortable with that. And at the same time, it also is disturbing to see a kind of whitewashing of American Buddhism here in this country. So there's this kind of grappling, I think, that goes on. And, I'm also thinking just last week, I was speaking with the Buddhist Church of Oakland with their junior YBA members, the Young Buddhist Association members. And it was just so inspiring to hear these high school students talk about how they really wanted to encourage other Asian American Buddhists not to be hemmed in by these stereotypes. So for example, in their tradition, they're not vegetarian. They don't have celibate monks, right? But they face these stereotypes, even in school and from peers, from teachers, even when Buddhism isn't really taught in its full diversity and complexity. And so they were actually urging people, don't be limited by these stereotypes of the Oriental monk or the superstitious immigrant, or even this kind of model minority stereotype. And I really like that word humility that you use. It relates to this other passage. I won't read it, but it's on page 179, where Shubha talks about someone, she herself, or Shubha, they were raised Hindu actually and came to Buddhism later, but yes, talking about, being surprised that people are surprised by things like sexual abuse in Buddhist traditions, in the sense that, like, I think this quote is really good, like, if Asian Americans were represented, I think the religion would take on more of the truth of every religion. People would have more stories, some positive, some negative, and Buddhism would be less on a pedestal, right? Less idealized.
Yeah, I think, and related to that is, I think that humility, as well as a non-idealization, is that it also kind of connects to this idea of responsibility that I've really been thinking a lot about, where it's, for me, for example, for me as a Sinhalese Buddhist, it is my responsibility to serve the community, but also sometimes to call out harms done in its names towards other ethnic or religious minorities, and not resist identification with Buddhists, with being a Sinhalese Buddhist. And oftentimes that is something that I see that might happen where it's a choice, like there could tend to be a optional kind of part of Buddhism for white Buddhist, or in the sense of that is cultural baggage. And in some ways, I've been thinking about this idea of cultural baggage as it's not just something that, as in it, that baggage is not something that's optional for a Sri Lankan Buddhist or a Buddhist who's grown up in that. It is my baggage, and it is my responsibility to take care of it. If it has to take care of it for its good, as well as when there are harms done in its name, to call out for that as well. So I think that the cultural baggage, although it seems there is a negative association with it, I think there is also some kind of truth to it, is that we have obligations and responsibilities to our baggage. So thank you for sharing some of your thoughts on that. Following up on that, some of the things I found really that I have been personally interested with my research with Sri Lankan Buddhists is the role that giving, generosity, and service, also called dana, and the connected theories of karma, rebirth, and merit play in the lives of Buddhists. In my experience doing research here among mostly meditation-centered Buddhist communities, there's often a reluctance to take these aspects of the tradition seriously. And can you share a little bit about to what extent these ideas may figure in the lives of the Asian American Buddhists, the young Asian American Buddhists that you write about?
I think they really figure a lot. And so I'm really grateful for you for lifting up these themes. I think I just want to comment too about this idea of cultural baggage, because I think that is a negative stereotype. And I'm really appreciative of Joseph Chia kind of challenging, as he says, modernized Buddhists of the West to look at their own Orientalized baggage. So I think that's one way to remember we all have baggage, right? No one is exempt from quote unquote cultural baggage. And then the other way I like to think about it is exactly that baggage doesn't have to be a burden in the sense of like a crushing weight. I mean, I sometimes think our baggage might just be our raft to the other shore, or it might be our vehicle to liberation. Kazi was mentioning this just in our recent conversation, but I think it's important to remember Buddhism has always been transmitted through culture, and yet it's never been entirely bound or reducible to culture. It is, after all, a universal religion. And so to me, that's so powerful that Buddhism can help us find this kind of middle way between these extremes of, let's say, on the one hand, ethnic determinism, but then on the other hand, ethnic cleansing, or you could say on the one hand, cultural clinging, and on the other hand, kind of cultural erasure. So I feel like this middle way is also this very hybrid way that a lot of Asian American Buddhists themselves are living. And I think it's really I think in lots of particularly more secularized forms of Buddhism, we do see a kind of erasure of generosity or karma, rebirth, merit, ethics. And I think it's really a pity to discard these really core parts of the Buddhist tradition. I mean, I think about how, yes, peace and calm are part of the Buddhist tradition, but so is samvega, so is being stirred by a sense of spiritual urgency. So I think indeed being kind of disturbed by these inevitabilities of sickness, old age, death, or the kinds of strife and suffering that seem preventable, warfare, ethnic conflict, racial conflict. And so for me, engaging with these concepts, and I think for many of the young adult Buddhists I speak to, it challenges us actually to take responsibility for our actions, especially exactly as you said, it shakes us out of a sense of complacency. And I think it also stirs in us this kind of possibility of developing a sort of deep kinship with all beings, right? And yeah, there's a lot. I love this topic so much. I feel like we could have a whole other event just on talking about these very much interwoven subjects.
Great, thank you. I'm sure there'll be other questions also in the Q&A that you'll be able to dive back into those questions. So this is kind of one of my closing questions. And one of the things that I found in the stories you share is it brings to light a lot of the labor in a quiet way. It's not like a prominent feature, but I was really struck by the voices and the labor actually that of women, in particular mothers, grandmothers, aunties, and in the memories of a lot of these young people, connecting these young people to their various Buddhist traditions. Oftentimes in faith traditions, including Buddhism, it is a voice of male voice figures that we hear about, the monastics or the patriarchs of the temple, that we think about who are passing down these traditions. And we often tends to marginalize the role that women play in building Sangha. But some of the stories you share, including your own personal story, unsettles that narrative. And so I'd love to hear more about how maybe there are some stories in the book, as well as things that you didn't write about mothers and grandmothers and aunties, and especially reflecting on your experiences in Southeast Asia, where you also spent a significant amount of time.
Yeah, I'm just so grateful to you for mirroring that to me, because I actually hadn't thought of like grandmothers as one of the threads that weaves through this book until you piloted it back for me, actually, and then I was thinking, oh yeah, of course, there's like Aaron, who was raised Jewish, but talking about his Buddhist grandmother and how she had turned this closet into this smoky altar, and how he was always a little bit scared of that as a kid, but also very intrigued by it, and how that left a kind of imprint on him as he got older. And also that she had given him a Buddhist amulet that he wore and that his father wore. So this kind of, again, speaking of, the beauty of just physical objects in Buddhism, the symbolism of that. And then, yeah, there was my own story as well. I'd always thought that my family was like atheist, going multiple generations back. I was born in Shanghai, but came at a young age to the US. And we are from an urban middle-class family, so kind of quite secular in orientation. And then it was actually by going to a diasporic Chinese temple in San Francisco for a Lunar New Year celebration. There was this food item, I didn't know what it was. And I was like, oh, I don't know what this is. So I asked my mom, and she's like, oh, that's cigu, that's arrowhead. And I was like, oh, ci, that first character means compassion, actually. And she's like, yeah, I used to like fry that up. Like I used to, with my grandmother over the Lunar New Year, we would cut it up and like fry it and eat it like a potato chip. And I bring this up because I think it's so fitting that I learned this piece of family history through food. It's always through the gateway of food, right? And then really just as an offhand remark, my mom said, oh yeah, and I also remember how my grandma used to chant Buddhist chants. And I didn't really understand what she was doing. And then just had this moment, it's like, oh, well, my great grandmother was Buddhist. And there's a way in which the chants that she heard kind of have now reverberated and found their way into my life here in the US, which just feels so extraordinary. And so it's interesting to think about, we have this Oriental monk stereotype, but why don't we have like I don't know, let's say the energetic nun or the indispensable laywoman. Like I have met so many of both, right? And women have long been this backbone of Buddhism, even though they've been largely marginalized and erased from the history, as I think arguably is true for most religious traditions. But I think those stories are there if we look at them. And so it does take some like looking and like, right, deliberately looking, as I'm so glad that, you did. And I'm also thinking, besides the nuns, without whom I can't imagine Buddhism thriving, but also the mothers and daughters and the aunties and grandmothers, who feed the community, right? They're doing it like, I think of just like in these small moments, like one peeled vegetable at a time, they feed the community. I think their donations to the temples, those small, they're building the temples like one roof tile at a time, right? These women's meditation, their chanting, their ritual, they get passed on to the next generation just by virtue of their very steadfast example. And so I think my own Buddhist path has been very much shaped by women here in the States, and also in my time living in Cambodia and living in Thailand, and seeing how so much of the tradition is very much carried on by the labors of women, exactly as you mentioned.
Great, thank you so much. And I think grandmothers is a great place to close our conversation. And I'm mindful of the time, so I'd like to give a lot of time for our Q&A. Yeah. Thank you, Chenxing. It was great talking.
Thank you, Nalika. I wish this conversation could go on, but I too am curious to hear from the audience, and I hope the audience will share ask questions both of me and also of Nalika as well.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. It's really wonderful to hear from both of you and hear you in conversation with each other. So we are going to start off today actually with a question from an attendee watching on YouTube. And this is for both of you. They're interested in hearing from both Chenxing and Nalika. And I'll just read the question. So speaking of intersectionality, which you've both spoken about quite a bit tonight, what are your thoughts from the perspective of Asian American Buddhists in terms of the connection between the rise of anti-Asian sentiment here at home and the unequal distribution of vaccine in the global South, particularly India and Nepal, as well as the freedom struggle of Palestinians? What are our responsibilities as Asian American Buddhists to these intersectional international struggles? What insights or practices from Buddhism can we draw from to inform our praxis?
I can't see Chenxing's screen, so I'm not sure which one of us.
Do you want to go ahead, Nalika?
Sure. There's a lot in that question, and I appreciate that person's question. And I think we could spend a lot of time speaking about many of these elements. I've been writing about, I've written a little bit about COVID-19 happening in Sri Lanka and its impact also in the rest of South Asia. And one of the things that was happening, so in the context of Sri Lanka, for example, I was there for a few months during the pandemic, stuck in Sri Lanka, visiting my mom, and then the travel restrictions happened. But there was an opportunity during that time where to experience and witness Buddhist monks who were chanting it was 7 days of chanting that they did as a form of blessings for the island. So they chanted over waters that holy water that then was spread throughout the country as a form of spiritual protection. And more recently, I know that there's been some chanting that was done by the monks towards for the blessings of India for the victims of the happening in the neighborhood countries. So there are these kind of transnational forms in which Buddhist clergy and Buddhists in South Asia have been looking at responding to the pandemic. And at the same time, on the flip side, there have been instances in which Muslim minorities have been victimized in the context of Sri Lanka's COVID-19, with the burials of Muslims being prohibited, and Sri Lankan Buddhists not really speaking up for it, and in many ways condoning it. So it's very complex in that way. So those are just some personal examples I'm sharing in which Buddhism kind of intersects in very complex ways in both bringing about peace or creating connections that are transnational, as well as in ways that these communities can also cause harm. So yeah, that's one of my responses to that.
Yeah, I'm just really appreciating this question. I feel that it would be actually very worthwhile to have a whole workshop on this with many different perspectives on it, because there's a lot in here, so some things that immediately jump to mind. What are our responsibilities, to touch on what Nalika and I were talking about? I think that as Buddhists, it does, I do just think every day about like, what can we do? And whether it's something small, whether it's generosity or donations to help alleviate some of the efforts, I think especially of COVID in India and Nepal, the birthplace of Buddhism. So I think there are a lot of people who feel that kind of connection. And then in the Middle East, just thinking very simply about Buddhist teachings around how violence begets more violence, how hatred begets more hatred. So I think there's a lot we can draw on from Buddhist teachings. I think there's a lot that Asian American Buddhist communities are already doing, whether it's donating or whether it's political advocacy, bringing these issues to the forefront and not thinking of them as separate. Again, I think there's so much in Buddhism that helps us understand it's truly transnational, it's truly global, like interspecial, right? Like it's not just humans who are connected, we're connected to so much. And so any kind of harm that's happening, even if it's far from here in this very, often very privileged location we have in the West, is not separate. Like it is all interconnected. And yeah, so what insights and practices can we draw from Buddhism? I think there's such a diversity within Buddhism. And I think so connecting to that within American Buddhism has been so much, I think, a part of my hope in writing Be the Refuge, or in having May We Gather, this reminder that, in addition to mindfulness meditation, things that are more visible, chanting, as Nalika said, and ritual, that these are also really important and really powerful resources within the Buddhist tradition to help us ground ourselves and then help us engage in really the lifetimes long work, if I will say, of addressing these kinds of disparities, of addressing pandemic, of addressing warfare.
Next question.
So another question that we got is there a regular gathering of Asian American Buddhists from across the country that I can join?
I don't know if there is, but Nalika and I have been working with a bigger collective of people that is trying to work towards creating these kinds of gatherings, because I am starting to hear that question more and more. And, you know, I think there are specific communities that might have an Asian American affinity group, for example, and I see these efforts cropping up, but it is a bit hard to organize us because we're just so diverse. There's so many different ethnicities and lineages and languages represented. And so May We Gather, I think, gave me a sense that maybe this is possible, but I think it will take a collective effort and more people wanting this, and then more people working to create that. I don't know if Nalika, if you have anything to add, especially based on our work together with planning the API group.
I think there's also the Sakya did the International Women's Conference. I'm not sure of the name of that correctly, but it is a gathering that happens, I think, annually, and checking that out might be one place where women, Buddhist women, transnationally connect.
Yes, so Sakyadita, and it's also open to men as well. I've been a few times, and usually it's not in America, but it is a really powerful gathering of Buddhist women. And someone mentioned in the chat every 2 years. Yeah, I think that sounds about right for Sakyadita.
I can answer this question about the Myanmar situation. Sri Lanka has a parallel situation and troubling circumstances as a Buddhist country. And I think one of the things that we sometimes may associate is it is a Buddhist country, therefore it should not be causing harm. But Buddhism is a tradition. It is not. It has a historical, social, political context that it comes from, and yes, it's causing harm, and yes, these are troubling circumstances and disappointing oftentimes, and it's not really a question of, oh, how can these people act like this, but it is like where the understanding it in the historical context, and in fact calling it out and challenging those things is part of the responsibility of being a Buddhist from countries that have these kinds of problems. So I don't think it's really an issue of understanding how is it that Buddhists can behave so badly kind of idea, but that like every human being in this world, Buddhists are people, and they come with certain kind of political, social kind of circumstances that shape their world. And it's connected to like not idealizing a tradition.
Yeah, I'm so glad you point out to roots, right? I think that also really applies well to the first question we had around how to see, the freedom struggles of Palestinians or the inequalities in the global South. It's sort of, as Buddhists also, we're trying to understand the kind of root causes and conditions and to try in different ways to address these causes and conditions. And I think about the kind of worldly winds, as is often translated, of like pleasure and pain, or, fame and disrepute, or gain and loss, and blame and shame, or like that had like, I think blame is one of them, and then I'm blanking on the other one. But this idea, I think, like it can be very easy to fall into blame, or you can get blame or you can get praise, right? And I think like moving away from one of those or the other, but really trying to look deeply into these root causes and to humbly make efforts to try to affect them, knowing that our efforts are just one of many. And so our intention may be one thing, our impact will be another. So we both try to make sure our intentions are wholesome, and then to examine our impacts and to continually adjust because the circumstances are continually changing.
Thank you so much. Another question from the chat. Can you share more about skillful ways to support accessing the middle way between cultural clinging and cultural erasure, particularly within a larger white convert Buddhist context?
You know, I actually, for people who haven't visited a Buddhist Churches of America temple or a Shin Buddhist temple, I definitely recommend just visiting. They're very welcoming. And I say that because to me, I actually think that because they've been Buddhist in America for multiple generations, they actually kind of live the answer to this question, I think, in a very beautiful way, as they've had to adapt to a first generation that was primarily Japanese speaking. And then now the focus is more on English, but there's still these Japanese chants. And so I think that actually going and visiting temples and seeing the ways that they navigate this tension is always really interesting. And then I also want to thank Donna Ozawa, who for mentioning in the chat the API Sangha. This is, sorry, going a little back to this question of like a national Buddhist gathering. I guess I should say, because now that we're online, in some ways, any AAPI Sangha can be essentially a national Sangha, but the AAPI Sangha in LA does meet online every Tuesday at 7 o'clock Pacific time. So she put that email in the chat. So I think I do want to say that there are these, again, pockets, and because of this online space, you know, that's accessible. But I think there's still more efforts for us to try to create these physical spaces where we can gather in person. And I don't know, Nalika, if you had some thoughts about this really great question about access, that navigating that middle way between cultural clinging and cultural erasure, especially given your research on BIPOC within predominantly white communities.
I think you answered that question really well. Yeah, the middle way is the kind of, I think what some of the ways in which the people in your book talk about it is really illuminating, where they, and the direct quotes you shared early in the beginning of this frustration with the cultural erasure, but at the same time, I don't know, I'm not understanding if these are dualities of cultural clinging, cultural erasure as, so I think you answered your question really well. That question, no, so nothing to add there.
So one of the things that popped up in the chat was someone asking for discussion about engaged Buddhism versus enraged Buddhism. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that for both of you.
I've never heard it articulated in this way. So this is a really fascinating way to think about this. I don't know, I almost would want to hear more about what comes to mind when the person asks this question, thinks about engaged Buddhism or enraged Buddhism. Something that does come up quite often is around this question of anger. So we didn't really get a chance to go very deeply into talking about the angry Asian Buddhist, but he, in that title, is a riff off the angry Asian man. And so Aaron was, when writing that blog, was trying to use anger kind of as a skillful means. So I think of, if we think about fire, like it can be a spark that warms us. Or, you know, here we have these forest fires here in California, and we know that we need to have sort of controlled burns in order to prevent them from being even greater. And so I think that I can't imagine a fully enraged Buddhism that was always enraged, but I think that I wonder, you know, to what extent we can make room for feelings of anger or even rage within Buddhist communities as, I think, very understandable expressions of outrage against extreme injustices that, you know, some of which we've talked about this evening together. And then how then do we use that as fuel in a way that doesn't harm ourselves or harm others, because anger can have a tendency to do that. So maybe there's a way in which there's moments of enraged Buddhism that then turn into an engagement that weaves that as one strand with many other strands in a way that can be helpful in addressing and alleviating suffering.
Great, thank you so much. Another question that we got in the chat, I'll just read it out loud. It says, The other day, two prominent white Buddhist teachers were introduced as having introduced Buddhism to the West in an event meant to address the impact of COVID in India. Strangely, they just nodded and smiled. Do you think it's time to challenge white Buddhists more overtly about these claims that they are credited for? And can you share what ways that can look like?
I think it's important just to correct people when they make factually untrue statements like that. That erases more than a century of Buddhist history of, Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants, for example, who brought Buddhism to this country. It erases the contribution of people in the BCA. You can imagine how hurtful it would be for some of those junior YBA members that I spoke to this past Sunday to hear statements like that. And I've been really encouraged by people who have spoken up with love and with care. It doesn't have to, again, be shaming the person who said that statement. In fact, I've heard from many people saying, this was just the narrative I inherited. I thought Buddhism began in America in the 60s and 70s with white converts who went to Asia and brought it to us. And so I think there's a way in which we can kindly but firmly say, this is the historical truth, and also this is the impact for people, especially of Asian heritage, when they hear that. And also, as Buddhists, we do really want to try to see clearly the truth. So we want to try to help people understand and not pass on this kind of misinformation. And I know it takes a lot of courage to speak up, especially if someone's a minority and predominantly white convert community. And here, I think finding BIPOC and AAPI Sanghas has, I think, been a huge support, because many people in these Sanghas themselves have spoken up in moments exactly like this and might be able to provide feedback. And I would also just want to add, I really hope people aren't too hard on themselves if in the moment they didn't speak up, because it is really hard. It's often one of those, after the fact, you think of all the things you could have said or acted. But so to be gentle with oneself in that circumstance, and also to remember, it's never too late. It's possible to send an email. And in fact, that might be more skillful than speaking, or might feel more safe than speaking up, in that moment, in that space, that there are ways to follow up. And I think we can follow up in ways that, again, we're trying to deepen our spiritual friendship with each other, I think, ultimately. And so if I made a statement, for example, that was incorrect, I would be probably mortified to be corrected, because it never feels good. But I would also just be really grateful to the person who helped correct me, and so that I don't, continue to pass on misinformation.
Thank you so much for your answers. Another question is, what steps can we take as Buddhists to bridge the seeming racial divide between the Asian and Black communities?
Nalika, do you want to say anything, or I can jump in?
I'll let you start. I have some thoughts, but I'll let you start.
Yeah, that question was really a core question for us as we planned the May We Gather ceremony. And I think it was really important that we had someone like Myoke, who is herself Asian and Black, that we showed Young Ayu's sons, who talked about what it felt like to be discriminated as Black people and Asian people in this country, that this is a history that runs deep. And also to have Dr. Larry Ward at the end of his talk, it was just deeply moving for him to say, I stand with you, I cry with you, my ancestors, past, present, and future, I shed these tears. And I think there are so many actual commonalities, so many ways that, of course, there are differences. And I think it's easy to point out those differences. It's easy to talk about that violence. But I think Buddhism, actually, especially for those of us who are Buddhists, who are meditators, provides this common ground, provides a way for us to do that bridging. And I really see that happening more, it seems, especially in this past year. And I think that has to do with rising awareness about both communities, with Black Lives Matter, with Stop AAPI Hate. And then we start looking again at the root causes and conditions, and we just start forming friendships with people. I think it really starts there in a very simple way. Again, like what we hoped this event could feel like, that we're all having tea together. We're talking about race. It's not always a comfortable conversation, but we need to have these conversations. And then can we participate in ceremonies together, in rituals together? I just want to add that. So I signed up for this Google Alerts for Asian American plus Buddhist. And I've had it for about a decade, but like for the first 8.5 years, but basically I get like 1 or 2 hits a year. And then now I get things, multiple times a week. And one recent article was written by a Black man named Ed Gaskin, who was so kind of hurt by this rise in anti-Asian violence and the rise in or his pain from the Atlanta shootings. And he's Christian, but he went to Buddhist temples and he made offerings. He went there and he prayed. And I think, wow, like what a powerful example of, again, going to people's places of worship, asking them what do they need, and also vice versa, right? I think that Buddhists for Black Lives Matter, for example, was organized by David Wu, who runs an Asian American Buddhist Sangha in LA. So actually, I think we can take so many steps and it's an ongoing process, and that we can also take heart that a lot of people are already doing this work and are committed to continuing to do this work of bridging essentially like some differences that I think in many ways, again, have been just historically that we've inherited. And we're saying, we don't want this inheritance. We don't want this inheritance where there's a divide between Black and Asians. We want to stand together and work together in solidarity.
I think one of the sons of the victims, one of the victims that was shared during Maybe Gather, they are biracial children as well, and they were talking really about their experience as Black and Asian biracial people, and how their mother kind of raised them with this understanding and recognition of calling out, and also honoring both these traditions and experiences they've also mutually felt of being marginalized in these different experiences. So I think how they talked about it was really enlightening.
Thank you. I think we probably have time for 2 or 3 more questions, maybe. This next one kind of responds directly to the conversation you were having about anger and the use of anger. The question asks, this has been such a wonderful conversation and I look forward to reading your book. I'm thinking about white Buddhists chastising Asian Buddhists for the anger they feel about the racism we experience in white-centered Buddhist communities. What are some effective responses to critiques of being bad Buddhists when we show anger at the racism we're facing? I've been referencing the fact that His Holiness the Dalai Lama has a book titled Be Angry, which encourages people to have and even maintain anger at social injustice until it's upended. But I'd love more of your thoughts on this, skillful responses we can have when criticized in this way. Thank you.
I'm so delighted His Holiness has that book. I need to check that out. I want to say that's a beautiful that's a beautiful answer. Oh gosh, this is a big question. I think I need a moment to think about it. And Nalika, I wonder if you have any thoughts, or maybe we can.
I think for myself, and just personally thinking about this, is that I think it's great that there are leaders who are sharing these ways of giving legitimacy for anger. But I think I don't know if we always need traditions to tell us, or traditional leaders to give us the legitimacy that these are real. These are real experiences and feelings that we're having, and that there is that the need to respond to these things need to be backed up from an authority figure, but that we can actually make those claims without an authority figure justifying it. So at the same, as much as I do appreciate having a religious leader speak and give that legitimacy, I think we also could speak from just our own truth, and knowing that when sharing that kind of frustration or challenging the kind of spaces that you're in from your own personal experiences and on behalf of others, not just yourself, but creating a space that is open for others to invite others in and to feel more comfortable and experience the tradition in different ways.
I'm really glad you bring that up, Nalika, because it makes me think actually again of the young Shin Buddhists who often face the stereotype. And to them, they say, like, I'm human before I'm Buddhist, actually, and I'm a human who has emotions. And so this is a normal thing to feel. I think sometimes remembering that, reminding people of that kind of humanity, where especially for Asian Americans, that we're neither robots nor are we some kind of unflappable Oriental monk figures. And so I think that's one way. And it often depends on the situation. But I think also sometimes if there's a way to maybe even humorously address the situation, that can also often help. And so to remember, it doesn't always have to feel like heavy corrective work, but sometimes maybe just infusing a little dose of humor into the conversation, or talking about the implications about that, that can be helpful.
Great, thank you. And so we have one more question tonight, and I think this is a good question to end on, because where do we go from here? What kind of community outreach and engagement events have you found to be super effective?
Nalika, I'm curious in your research if you have thoughts on this, because you've also connected with a lot of different communities.
Yeah, I think, so I've been doing research more lately on inside meditation centers and looking at how BIPOC people, practitioners, teachers have been creating spaces both within institutions and outside of institutions, in their living rooms, using the internet as a platform to gather and talk about their shared experiences, racialized experiences as Americans, and also there are certain communities that are meeting specifically, like South Asian groups or African American descent communities, that are creating that space of comfort and safety where they can talk about specific distinct experiences, complexities of those experiences. And so I think there's so many models out there already in the world, and and that there are lots of resources out there to apply. And I think a lot of institutions now have these kinds of spaces, but there's also a lot on Facebook, a lot on social media, so BIPOC groups, POC Sanghas and such.
Yeah, and
including what Donna was saying, which was the API group that meets also.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I think but especially obviously I have a sort of bias towards events that are more dialogical. And then, I mean, it would be difficult with all the people on this call, but to really meet and hear each other's stories, right? That was so much a part of the method and also the ethos of my book. But I think I've noticed in events where people can just share and deeply listen to each other. This book, and I think even May We Gather, emerged kind of out of a deep listening of what was needed. And I think there's a way in which having these dialogues, and then we are able to work together, whether it's on a small project or a big project, or perhaps it's a book club of reading around a certain issue, or perhaps, I feel like even through the questions today and the chat today, we've emerged. There's so many ideas have emerged for different projects or different workshops or different events that we might do. And so it's connecting up with those people and then really enjoying the process, right? Even if the work can be hard work. And I think actually our wonderful hosts today very much embody and model this for us. You've done so much hard work in putting together the speaker series. And but I think this series has been incredibly effective for raising awareness about Buddhism and race.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, thank you so much. It has been such a joy to have both of you here in dialogue, talking about things that we really need to just talk about and discuss. And thank you everyone who came to the webinar and on YouTube for joining us on this 5th event in the Harvard Buddhist Community's Buddhism and Race Speaker Series. And our next event will be on June 17th with Dr. Shante Paradigm Smalls. And you can learn more about upcoming events and join our mailing list by clicking on the link to our website in the chat. And I will turn it back to Chenxing to lead a closing practice of dedicating merit and sharing aspirations.
Thank you so much, Chantal. So just to close, I wanted to just do a simple dedication of merit all together. So I'll do a dedication of merit verse in Pali and Chinese and English briefly. And I also invite people, because I know some of you might need to sign off soon, to share your own aspirations, your own dedications in the chat. And since the chat will be saved, we can kind of co-create this dedication of merit together, and it can be shared together afterwards. Ye satta sanino atiye jasatta asanino katang punya palang mai hang sappe bagi bawan tude. 愿以此功德普及于一切，我等与众生皆共成佛道。May the merit of our gathering today be universally shared with all beings, so that we may collectively realize the way of all awakened ones. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. We very much look forward to seeing you next month. And thank you so much to our amazing panelists and dialogue, Chenxing and Nalika. We are so grateful to have you tonight. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.